are very, very pleased to see you this morning. We have been having high-quality sessions that have been going on and have been high-quality meetings, and we are very, very pleased. Last night, we had gala dinner with excellent presentation by the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines. And I'm quite sure most of you have been busy this morning calling your travel agencies and switching to Ethiopian Airlines. That's great. Let me just mention that other partners, airline partners that we have been working with include Air Canada, Swissair, Air Maroc, that also working with us as a partner airline. This morning, we are going to have another outstanding sessions that are going to be going on. So we want to invite you to pay attention. At this session, we are going to start, and then we are going to be moving to two separate sessions. This morning, we are going to call a person that you have been hearing. If you have not had a chance to hear him from day one or day two, you are going to be hearing about him today. Mr. Negatu is a managing partner of Ethiopia and head of transaction with Ernst & Young. He is an outstanding speaker. He has made a number of presentations. He has been in our sessions. He made presentation even at a major event that happened in US. At the World Economic Forum, many forums where he has been there to make a presentation to talk about the relationship between Canada, between Africa and the rest of the world, and why Africa matters. And I'm going to call Mr. Negatu to come to give us an overview of what's happening in world of business in Africa today, and also to capture everything else that has been going on for the last 2 days. Mr. Negatu.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Good morning. Now, I don't take that. I'll try this again. Good morning. Good morning. Fantastic. I am sure you've had Ethiopian coffee, right? The juiced up version, the one that gets 4.8 out of 5 on the Starbucks rating. So you can't say good morning. You just say, yeah, good morning. All right, Nola, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm obviously very pleased to be back in Canada. I've been here a couple of days. The interesting thing is, I know Canada, at least I like to think I know Canada, because I went to school in Montreal back when, don't ask me, I have a little gray hair, so you can calculate my age. And I loved Canada. I had a choice of countries when I was a kid to go to school, and I chose to come to Canada, except one thing, I'm from a very tropical climate, okay, from Africa. And then when I landed in Montreal, it was near zero, and this was like in October, so I could see what the winter was going to be like. So one winter for me was enough. I packed my bags and moved to Washington more than 30 years ago, but I still have very fond memories of Canada. Any opportunity I get to come here, I take it. So when Nola and the good folks here at CCAfrica invited me, I said, sure, I'll come. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take maybe 10 minutes, no more than that, maybe 15 minutes. You'll see the slides. It says executing growth strategies in Africa, all right? I think a few of you saw me speak the other day at the Ethiopia focus session. That was strictly Ethiopian focused, and obviously the emotional part of it was like at 100 there. So now for Africa, it might be 90, 95, okay? So let me just walk you through what I'm going to talk about. But before I do, those of you who know our firm, we have lots of lawyers, most of them American lawyers, and they tell me before I say even a word about investing in Africa, doing anything in Africa, they say I have to put up this slide called a disclaimer. Even with a big screen, we made sure you can't read it. Okay, it's called a fine print. The font size small by design, all right? All it means is if you like everything I tell you this morning, you go invest in Africa, in particular in my home country, Ethiopia, you do extremely well. It just means that you send the dividend checks to me, you share it with me. If, on the other hand, the returns of investments were more like 15, 20% in Africa, you can't just say, Zem, you told me if Africa was fantastic, I was going to make double my money in 1 year. I would just say, did you read the disclaimer? That's all it means, okay? For the lawyers in the room, you understand that. What I'm going to talk about is, listen, you have a beautiful country, right? I mean, this is a huge country. I'm sure everybody would be envious to be a Canadian, right? As opposed to, say, an American down south, right? There's only 30-some million of you, and you have this huge, wealthy country. So sometimes it's difficult for people like me to come here and try to convince you to part with some of your cash to park it in Africa, right? So I have to try to put things in context for you why you might want to think about Africa. And the numbers we can run, I mean, I'm an investment banker. I'm in the transactions business, so I run numbers every day. So I want to put it in context so that you have an idea where we're going globally and then where Canada and North America has to start fitting in so that this comfortable life we live here or in my adapted home country, the United States, can be sustained. There's good reasons why I'm going to show you. So I call this the global context. Now, at the moment, you and the Americans are extremely wealthy, so wealthy that you account for 22% of global GDP. 22%, just these two countries in North America. But what you would see in this graph, and I'm sure if you talk to people like me and others, there's a gradual shift of economic power from west to east. What does that mean? Well, over the next 30 years, the relative importance of North America, Canada and the United States combined, will be only half as much as it is today. It means that 22% will go down to 11%. That doesn't mean that you all go into the poor house. Well, at least the Americans think that if that were to happen, they would stop driving SUVs and drive these four-cylinder cars which they can't fit into, right? And they have to give up their big mansions. No, it doesn't mean anything like that, but you have to keep this in mind that this is where the trend is, from 22% to 11%. So what gives? Something has to give, right? Well, you'll see on the graph that in the next 30 years, Asia will account for half global GDP, half, as you'll see on the graph here, from 27% today. But the beautiful part, which is what I'm trying to bring you to Africa, which is the main topic of this conversation, is Africa, which accounts for only 4% of global GDP today, would account for 12%, 3 times what it is today. This is the kind of trend we need to put in context. When I talk to C-suite executives, Fortune 500, FTSE 200 companies, this is what they have in mind. This is how they start making long-term decisions. So the gradual shift of economic power from west to east needs to be taken into consideration. Now, we got a lot of data, but I will just show you a couple that illustrates the point. Last year, China's trade with Africa was $200 billion. If you go back to 2000, it was only under $20 billion. So it's now $200 billion. Look, the Americans, now they trade with Africa only at $85 billion. That's both import and export. So you see the ascendancy that one I was showing you about the shift in economic GDPs and global GDPs is being reflected in trade numbers. Canada is actually even worse. Now, I couldn't find the exact numbers. Our team couldn't find it. I'm sure it's somewhere. But we found a proxy. Your trade with Africa and the Middle East combined, as you would see, is less than 4%. In fact, we estimated your Africa portion is less than 2%. Again, if we keep in mind that's where the gradual shift is, I am sure this number has to change, right? Again, why? Because you want to continue to live a comfortable life. You want to live in a prosperous country. I know you're already prosperous, but here's the kicker. Here's sort of the slam dunks, one slider that puts things in perspective. I got this from Bill Gates, from his tweets. Last year, in the last 3 years, China used more cement than the United States used in the 20th century combined. That illustrates where this shift is taking place. You can go to the smaller emerging economies, you will start seeing these kinds of amazing numbers. It was so amazing, Bill Gates had to tweet this to the rest of the world, to his 21 million followers, and I happen to be one of them. So these are the kinds of things we need to keep in mind when we talk about Africa. The shift is taking place. So let me come to Africa's economy. My focus is actually mostly on FDI and other things, so relevant things. So what the African economy? Well, over the last 10 years, since 2000, Africa's GDP has tripled. Today, actually, Africa's GDP is bigger than Canadian GDP. You'll see it's bigger than Indian GDP, and it's close to the Brazilian economy. But you'll see the trend by 2018, you'll have a GDP of $3 trillion. Now, I'm sure, even where I grew up in Washington, trillion is a big number. So nobody could refer to Africa with these kinds of numbers. $3 trillion with a big T, okay? Now, these are the kinds of numbers that, again, investors are looking at. It has grown by a factor of 3. Now, the numbers, some of these numbers, please keep in mind, it includes North Africa, okay? But the growth is the fastest in sub-Saharan Africa. What we also see is there's already a concentration of wealth in Africa as measured by GDP. And how do we know that? You'll see this from this graph here. The 4 biggest economies in Africa today account for 60% of the entire continent's GDP. Just 4 countries: Nigeria, South Africa, Angola, and Ethiopia. So if you are an investor, you're looking for volume, you're looking for countries that have size, this will be the place to start. But there's also an eye-opener, especially in the case of Ethiopia, which came from nothing, 12, 13 years ago, to be the 4th largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, this, by the way, does not include the recent rebasing of the Nigerian GDP, which will actually enhance that number I showed you. So when we fast-track this forward, just the 4, they'll continue to dominate the African economy. The 4 will continue to be around 62% of the African GDP over the next 15 years. And you will see that Ethiopia will move out to be the number 3 largest economy in Africa, eclipsing. But this is sort of a graphical illustration where we see the world over the next few years. The green, the better. The red, worrisome. The green means fast-growing economies, and you've seen some of this. But Africa, as you see, is mostly green. The whole continent, by and large, is doing extremely well. The other way of looking at it is for you, middle income, that term middle income may not mean anything because all this growth has to amount to something, right? You're already an upper income country. But in a lot of emerging economies, that middle income is a magic word. That's where most emerging economies are aspiring to achieve. By our estimate, by 2025, 75% of African countries will achieve middle income. 75%. Again, if you were to go back 15, 20, God forbid, in the mid-70s, none of this was imaginable. But today, it is becoming a reality. I put this graph just to juggle the mind. So what happens? I do a lot of emerging markets, mergers and acquisitions, especially in the consumer products space. One of the things investors are looking for is this thing called middle class. Well, what you find today, Africa has 300 million people classified as middle class. What does that mean? It's bigger than the middle class in India. So next time when somebody tells you, I'm looking to invest in India versus in Africa, you tell them, where is more middle class than India? So now let me give you the results of our annual Africa Attractiveness surveys. I kind of tried to put this together. And in our firm, for the last 5 years, we have put out, and you can download this from our website, we have prepared what's called the Africa Attractiveness Survey. And the new one just came out a couple months ago. This is our 4th one. It analyzes mostly FDI, foreign direct investment, but it has also an impact on the broader economy. We talked to 500 global investors from 38 countries. So this result of the survey is based on the input that we get from these individuals. They're investors from emerging markets, from developed economies, and various sectors. As you will see, the reports for the last 4 years, the first one we put out, and this shows you how we have evolved in Africa. The first one we put out in 2011, it was an aspirational one. It was called It's Time for Africa. At that time, only 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, not very many people were paying attention to Africa as much. So we had to focus on this emotional aspect of it. We're there, it's our time. As you can see from the reports, the headlines of our reports, the cover pages of our reports, we even have evolved along with the people who are investing in Africa. So we went from It's Time for Africa to Building Bridges in 2012. 2013, we called it Getting Down to Business. And the final one we just put together is called Executing Growth. Because what is starting to happen is investors are telling us, Ernst & Young, others, don't tell me Africa is rising. We know that. Tell me how I'm going to invest. So that's why we are. The key highlights of our reports is that there's a dramatic overall improvement in investor perception. I'll show you. FDI numbers are increasing. And then urban centers are becoming very, very important for decision makers. But there's one kicker, the perception gap, which I'm going to show you. So what happens over the last 4 years of our studies? Africa was the 8th most attractive place in 2011. This year, only North America is considered to be more attractive than Africa as an investment destination. It's a remarkable turnaround. These are very sophisticated investors who know what they're doing. But what's also encouraging is going forward, even North Americans who are lagging behind the rest of the world in terms of picking up the momentum shift in Africa are starting to say that they do see the shift. They're more optimistic than it was in the past. So 3 out of 4 of the respondents are very positive about Africa's future going forward. But here's the problem part, what we call the perception gap. When we talk to investors, when we ask them about Africa, it's almost like the brain is split into 2. You'll see the one on the left, the yellow one. These are respondents from who have already done business in Africa. And guess what they tell us when we talk about Africa? They say Africa is the most attractive destination in the world. These are people on the ground, put their money, they're running businesses every day. But guess what happened to the other side of the brain? These are people who haven't set foot in Africa. They don't have any investments in Africa. Their response is diametrically opposed to those who are already on the ground. They're overwhelmingly negative about Africa. That means there's a perception gap here, which needs to be filled. Okay? So here's just some numbers. Of those who are on the ground, 73% say that over the last year, the last 2-3 years, Africa's attractiveness has improved. But you will see only 39% of those who are not on the ground. So this is why I think when we talk to African decision makers, corporate CEOs, and we say, use the 300 or those who are already on the ground as brand ambassadors, because they're telling people like us, they're doing deals with people like us in Africa on a daily basis, and they're very positive. So use them as brand ambassadors to convince the others who are not there yet. So what about FDI then? The sentiment has to shift. What we found is last year, FDI into Africa increased by 13%. Good. That's a very good part of it. But Africa still accounts for less than 6% of global FDI. This continent that we are talking about as being the next big emerging market is still lagging behind in terms of attracting. But at least there's an encouraging sign that the overall volume of investment. Overall, over the last 5-6 years, the cumulative annual growth of FDI into Africa was about 20%. Again, very, very encouraging. But what I also see is the reshuffling of the deck as to who's investing in Africa. The United States still remains the largest investor in Africa. But this is cumulatively. But I think if you were to look forward, probably China, probably the other emerging economies will overtake. But as of last year, this year when we did the survey, the United States and the UK are at the top. Now, unfortunately, you don't see Canada in here, right? I'm sure after this presentation, after this fantastic conference, I'm sure more Canadian companies will be investing in Africa, and next time we did this survey. Here's a surprise, by the way. Not only is there reshuffling of the deck of who's investing in Africa, but the sectors that people are investing in are not actually the ones that you would normally associate Africa with, right? Resources. According to our survey, the ones that are most attractive to investors, global investors, are the technology, media, and telecom sector, followed by a sector that I focus a lot on, which is the retail and consumer products. And I have a real-life example. We did a very large mergers and acquisition deal for a British company called Diageo. Those of you who may know Diageo. Excuse me. They did a very nice deal in Ethiopia a couple of years ago. Those are the kinds of investors that are coming to Africa. But the other thing we see is that Africans are taking ownership of their own continent. How do we know that? Next to the Europeans who are investing in Africa, the largest block of investors in Africa are Africans themselves. And you'll see this from the graph here. Now, they account for almost a quarter of investment. What does that mean, by the way? Well, it's like Dangote Cement from Nigeria putting $400 million in Ethiopia to build a cement factory. Or a Kenyan company going to Tanzania and investing in the retail business. Or South African companies coming, as we call, north of the Limpopo, which is the rest of Africa for them, investing in Africa. That's what inter-Africa FDI means, okay? The other trend that we see is that urban clusters are more attractive to FDI. Investors tell us that those will be one of the key criteria they look at when making investments. So what we see in Africa, and this graph shows you, these are the key urban centers in Africa, from Nairobi to Addis to Dar es Salaam and Johannesburg and Lagos and Nigeria and Accra. So these are just some of the trends. The sectors, the urban clusters, which are starting to attract. But what are the patterns of growth? And I think I need to hurry up because I think I'm running out of time here. Okay, thank you. So this is a pattern that we see. You enter Africa as a single market. Very soon you look at regional markets. So you set up, for example, headquarters in Addis or Nairobi. And then after that, you start looking for regional headquarters in the neighborhood. If it's in Lagos, next thing you look at is Accra. Again, eventually, you have to have multiple entry points in Africa. The old traditional way of entering Africa, for example, only through Johannesburg, is no longer the only option multinationals and global investors are looking at. We have developed a model, which I think I'm going to skip for now, only because of the interest of time. But in order to succeed in Africa, you don't just run Excel spreadsheets. That would tell you only part of the story. You have to have the ability to relate to people there, to communicate with the culture. You have to have the ability and patience to know that things take longer than it does in Canada. If you do all these things, which what we call the 7 Ps, just for the hell of it, I'll show you. This is what we call the 7 Ps, okay? I'll be happy to share it with you. But there are multiple 7 platforms you need to address if you want to succeed. So you have to, as I said, patience, perspective. Don't start with the risk perspective. Start with the opportunity. Is there opportunity? Because there are ways of addressing the risk, and smart people, smart consultants, others can address it by you. Your perspective matters. I've always said, start with the glass half full perspective. Don't start with the glass half empty. Then you won't get anywhere. Partnerships are very critical. In most African countries that I work, from the heads of states to the CEOs of companies and low level, they all want to be able to be part of the process of their transformation in Africa. Africans don't just want to be consumers. They want to have equity. They want to be able to participate with the investor. If you do that, your chances of success are much higher. Now, let me then come to some of the challenges. I can't be just telling you the positive, right? There are challenges. So what are some of the things that we see? Earlier, I talked about inter-Africa FDI. Well, this is the flip side of it. Inter-Africa trade is very low. We don't trade amongst ourselves. We'd rather be exporting our products to Canada or the United States or Europe. Even though the overall volume of inter-Africa trade has increased, as a percentage of total trade, it's still the same as it was 10 years ago. That has to change. That's partly because we have fragmented spaghetti maze of regional trading blocs, East African Community, ECOWAS, SADC, I mean, you name it. That needs to be dismantled. At least initially, it needs to be streamlined. This is one of my favorite slides, only because the bottom part you say it's called dark at night, right? This brings up, I'm sure you've heard this many, many times, the infrastructural challenges need to be addressed. We have a very good, I don't want to sound like I'm biased, I'm picking on Ethiopia today, but we have very, very good examples of countries that have made a very significant effort to upgrade their infrastructure. Ethiopia is one of them. It spends up to 70% of its annual budget on non-recurrent expenditures, essentially on infrastructure. That's why they're building the largest hydroelectric power dam in Africa, amongst the top 10 largest in the world. I think these are key lessons that other African countries should learn, because investors are telling us if there's no infrastructure in a country, they're not even going to put a penny in that particular country, okay? We have to streamline the operating environment, the ease of doing business. Africa has done a lot better than it did in the past, but we still occupy the bottom half of the World Bank's annual Ease of Doing Business report. Out of 189 countries, probably the bottom 30 are African countries. That needs to improve. As I said, Africa has done tremendously compared to, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago. But if we're going to become like Asian countries, the Asian tigers, the ease of doing business has to improve. Some of the impediments that investors are telling us include, of course, the issue of bribery and corruption. Now, I got to be honest with you. This is a double-edged sword. For every giver, there has to be a taker. Who gives? Usually investors from the developed world or other investors. So there needs to be a partnership. We can't just be ragging on Africans and say, you're all corrupt, your system. No, you can't. It's a partnership. So if we work together, we can address this issue of corruption in Africa. All right? I mean, I grew up in the U.S. I'm an American citizen. I can tell you, even in the U.S., corruption is a problem. But they can afford it. We can't. Africa can least afford corruption. But as long as it's not a partnership. But I just thought I would show you, though, because investors tell us this is an issue. But you'll see right below corruption, the number one impediment, the second largest issue for investors is improved transport and logistics infrastructure. I finance airlines for a living, okay? So over the last 10 years, I financed, I think, virtually every airline in Africa. Even today, in most African countries. If you want to go from one country, call it X, to a country Y, which are neighbors in Africa, you first have to go to Europe, come back to Africa. That needs to stop. So I have actually a very good example in that regard. Of what, again, as an example. Now, this airline just happens to be also a gold sponsor, so maybe I thought it was a nice segue into it. But they have managed to build the largest airline in Africa in Ethiopia. But how did that help? Over the last 10 years, the growth of this airline mimics the growth of the Ethiopian economy, which has grown by 10.4% GDP, year in, year out, for 10 years. At that same time, Ethiopian Airlines has become the largest and most profitable airline on the continent, which actually last year made more money than all African airlines combined. So the importance of the issue I just showed you, where investors telling us transport logistics infrastructure is an impediment, has actually been resolved in certain countries like Ethiopia. That needs to be addressed. Now finally, which is I think the word you were looking for, or conclusion, right? I don't know, some of you are old enough like me to remember that when Bill Clinton was giving his speech at the Democratic National Convention years ago. His speech lasted about an hour and 15 minutes. He's an eloquent speaker. But the biggest applause he got was when he came to say, finally, in conclusion. So I'm sure I'll get a big applause when I say conclusion. As you've seen, I think Africa has made tremendous progress, right? FDI is increasing, the sectors, diversifications, a lot of good things are happening. So for us, the reason we're optimistic about Africa is not just one issue. I mean, we talk about the improvements in democracy, including, no. It's a whole bunch of series, it's not just one thing. So what we've said here is that part of the reason we're encouraged about Africa going forward, doing well, the next big emerging market, is because we see steady growth in some of the bigger economies like Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa. We also see the investor perception changing gradually, sustainably. They're becoming more and more positive. And I think FDI coming into Africa, which is the litmus test, by the way, at the end of the day, somebody's putting money in the continent. When you take all this together, all the other good things you heard about, I'm sure yesterday, here, today, and tomorrow, the demographic dividends, urbanization, young Africans inventing things. When you combine all that, I think there's no other way to conclude that is definitely Africa is on the move. It's definitely going to be the next big emerging market. And hopefully for Canadian investors in the room and others, the Africans in the room, there's room for optimism and come and invest in Africa. Thank you very much.